It was a quiet morning on June 25, 2014, in Orlando, Florida, when the illusion of tranquility was shattered. Police sirens wailed through the upscale neighborhood of Highland Ridge, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness as they converged on the elegant home of Robert Eldridge, a well-known real estate agent. Inside the sprawling residence, a grim discovery had just been made. Robert Eldridge, 48, was found dead in the basement of his own home. His body was brutalized, blood pooled beneath him, deep bruises around his neck. At first glance, it appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. The upscale lifestyle Robert led made him a likely target, or so it seemed. Yet as investigators began combing through the scene, something didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms. Whoever had killed Robert Eldridge knew him, and they likely knew the layout of his home. The news of Robert's murder sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Orlando community. To those who knew him, Robert had always appeared to be the quintessential family man. A successful real estate agent, he had built a reputation for himself as a man who could sell the dream homes of Orlando's wealthy elite. His marriage to Mandy Eldridge, the town's ambitious school principal and rising candidate for school superintendent, seemed like the perfect union. Together, they raised Mandy's son from a previous relationship, Grayson Eldridge, a 21-year-old college student who had recently returned home to live with them after a stint in rehab. From the outside, Robert's life looked picture perfect, but as detectives began peeling back the layers, they uncovered a twisted web of deception, betrayal, and manipulation that revealed the dark secrets behind Robert's pristine image. Detective Peter Dalton, a seasoned investigator with over 30 years on the force, was assigned to lead the Eldridge murder case. Known for his methodical approach and unshakable patience, Dalton took control of the scene, giving orders to his team of investigators as they meticulously combed through the house. There was something off about this case, he thought. The brutality of the crime didn't match the clean, upscale environment. It felt personal. The first person to be questioned was, of course, Mandy Eldridge. Grief-stricken, Mandy sat on the living room sofa, clutching a tissue in her hand, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. Despite her obvious distress, Mandy was poised, careful with her words. She told detectives that Robert had been out late the night before for work and had come home after she had already gone to bed. She hadn't heard anything unusual that night, she said, and when she found him that morning, she had immediately called the police. But as detectives questioned Mandy further, they began to uncover cracks in the perfect facade of her marriage. Mandy admitted that their relationship had been strained for years, though she insisted it was nothing unusual. The pressures of Robert's demanding job and her own rising career had taken a toll on their marriage. When asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Robert, Mandy hesitated. It was a small pause, but Detective Dalton noticed it. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Dalton asked, his voice calm but firm. Mandy looked down, wringing her hands. "Robert wasn't the man people thought he was," she finally said. "There were things about him, things I couldn't talk about, but I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't." As the investigation into Robert's murder deepened, detectives uncovered shocking revelations about his life. Behind the polished exterior of a successful businessman and devoted family man was a man living a secret double life. Robert had been having numerous extramarital affairs that stretched back years, but the most disturbing revelation came when detectives learned that many of these affairs were not with other women, but with men. The homes Robert showed as part of his real estate business had become secret rendezvous spots for his illicit meetings. He carefully curated this hidden side of his life, always mindful of keeping up appearances, but it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. One of Robert's secret lovers came forward during the investigation, revealing how Robert had used his position to meet and seduce men. His charm and affluence made him irresistible to some, but it also made him enemy. There was no shortage of people who had reason to despise Robert Eldridge, former lovers who felt used, partners whose relationships were destroyed because of him, and business rivals who envied his success. But one relationship in particular stood out: his stepson, Grayson Eldridge. Grayson Eldridge was no stranger to emotional turmoil. As a teenager, he had struggled with addiction, bouncing between rehab and home. Now, at 21, he was back in his mother's house, attending a local community college and working part-time at a bar. On the surface, it seemed like Grayson was trying to get his life back on track, but the truth was far more complicated. During questioning, Grayson admitted to having a tense relationship with Robert. While they had once been close, things had changed over the past 2 years. He spoke of Robert's controlling behavior and how his stepfather had become increasingly distant. But it wasn't until detectives pressed him further that Grayson revealed the most damning secret of all. For the past 2 years, Grayson had been involved in a secret sexual relationship with Robert. The revelation was shocking, not only to the investigators but to the entire Eldridge household. Grayson described how Robert had manipulated him, using his emotional vulnerabilities to maintain control over him. It was a toxic, damaging relationship that left Grayson feeling trapped and powerless. When asked if he had killed Robert, Grayson's answer was resolute. "No, I didn't kill him. I couldn't have, but I'm not sorry he's dead." With each new revelation, the investigation became more complicated. Mandy's emotional distance, Robert's hidden affairs, and Grayson's toxic relationship with his stepfather painted a picture of a deeply dysfunctional family. As detectives worked to unravel the mystery, one thing became clear. Someone close to Robert had killed him, and they had done it in a fit of rage. The more the investigation focused on Grayson, the more suspicious he appeared. His DNA was found at the crime scene, though it wasn't unusual given that he lived in the house. However, Grayson had an alibi for the night of the murder. He had been bartending. His co-workers confirmed his presence at the bar, but the timing of his return home was still in question. Detective Dalton wasn't convinced. There was something about Grayson's demeanor during questioning, a sense of deep emotional conflict that suggested he was hiding more than he let on. The investigation into Robert Eldridge's murder began to resemble a labyrinth of lies and hidden truth. Every step Detective Peter Dalton took seemed to uncover a new layer of deception, pulling him further into the dark, twisted relationships that define the Eldridge household. As the shockwaves from Robert's death spread throughout Orlando, the secrets he had guarded so carefully began to surface. The man everyone knew as a devoted husband and successful real estate agent was now exposed as someone living a life of duplicity. But while the town was reeling from the revelations, those closest to Robert, Mandy, and Grayson were forced to confront their darkest truth. For years, Mandy Eldridge had carefully curated her public image. As the school principal, she was respected in the community, seen as a model of ambition and determination. Her political aspirations only added to her drive for perfection. However, what few knew was how deeply she feared scandal, how the revelation of her husband's secret life could bring her carefully constructed world crashing down. When Mandy first discovered Robert's affair with Grayson 2 years earlier, her initial reaction wasn't anger, it was fear. The fear of what such a revelation would do to her career, her reputation, and her chances of becoming school superintendent. Mandy had always been pragmatic, and in her mind, the solution was clear. Keep the affair secret at all costs, but that was easier said than done. Grayson, her son, had always been emotionally fragile, struggling with addiction and a lack of stability in his life. The affair with Robert was breaking him, and Mandy could see it. Yet instead of encouraging Grayson to break free, she did the unthinkable. She pressured him to continue the relationship. Mandy knew it was wrong. She knew her actions were manipulating Grayson into staying in a relationship that was damaging his already delicate mental health, but she justified it to herself. If the affair became public, it wouldn't just be her career that was ruined. Grayson's life would be destroyed as well. She convinced herself that she was protecting him, that she was doing what was best for both of them. But in reality, Mandy was protecting her own ambition, using her son as a pawn in a twisted game of self-preservation. As the investigation widened, other figures from Robert's past began to come into focus. One of the most significant was Maria Torres, a 30-year-old waitress at a local diner whose fiery temper and outspoken nature made her an early suspect. Years earlier, Maria's life had been torn apart when she discovered her husband, Miguel, having sex with Robert in the bathroom of a house they were touring. The shock of that discovery shattered her marriage, leaving Maria bitter and angry. Maria's intense hatred for Robert was no secret. In the months following her divorce, she had publicly confronted him several times, hurling insults and threats. Friends and co-workers at the diner often heard her express her disgust for Robert, blaming him for the destruction of her life. To many, it seemed Maria had both the motive and the temperament to commit the murder. However, when police brought her in for questioning, Maria didn't flinch. She openly admitted her hatred for Robert, acknowledging that she had once wished he were dead, but she was adamant that she hadn't killed him. "I'm not that stupid," Maria said coldly during her interrogation. "Why would I waste my life on that piece of trash?" Despite her volatile history with Robert, Maria had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. She had been working a double shift at the diner, a fact confirmed by her manager and co-worker. With no evidence linking her to the crime, Maria was eventually ruled out as a suspect, but her bitterness toward Robert added another layer to the complicated narrative surrounding his life and death. Grayson's confession of his relationship with Robert had opened a floodgate of emotions, both for him and for the investigator. The idea of a stepson engaging in a sexual relationship with his stepfather was scandalous enough, but the emotional manipulation that had taken place over the years added a sinister element to the story. For Grayson, the affair with Robert had been a twisted combination of desire, confusion, and dependency. He had been just 19 when the relationship began, still struggling with addiction, self-worth issues, and emotional instability. Robert had entered his life as a father figure, someone who was supposed to help him, guide him, but instead, Robert had used his position of power to exploit Grayson's vulnerability. At first, Grayson had been drawn to the attention and affection Robert gave him. It filled a void in his life, a desperate need for validation. But as the affair continued, Grayson became increasingly conflicted. He knew it was wrong. He knew that Robert was using him. Yet, every time he tried to pull away, Robert would manipulate him back into the relationship, preying on his insecurities and dependence. When Grayson found out that Robert had been unfaithful, cheating not only on his mother, but on him with multiple other men, it shattered the fragile sense of stability he had tried to build. The betrayal cut deep. For Grayson, Robert wasn't just another lover. He was someone who had taken advantage of him at his most vulnerable, someone who had manipulated him into a life of secrecy and shame. As the pieces of the investigation began to come together, it became clear that the relationship between Robert and Grayson was a central focus. But while Grayson's emotional turmoil was evident, there was still no solid proof linking him to the murder. Detective Dalton was beginning to feel the pressure. The media had gotten wind of Robert's double life, and the public's fascination with the case was growing. Rumors and speculation were swirling. Was it a lover scorned? A revenge plot by someone Robert had wronged? Or was the answer closer to home? On July 3, 2014, the investigation took a dramatic turn. While reviewing the crime scene once more, one of Dalton's team members discovered a hidden camera, cleverly disguised as a smoke detector in the basement. It had been overlooked in the initial search, but now its presence offered a glimmer of hope for a breakthrough in the case. The footage recovered from the camera revealed weeks of activity in the basement. Robert had apparently installed it to keep tabs on his private space, unaware that it would become the key to solving his own murder. As the team reviewed the footage, they watched as Robert brought different men into the house, sometimes conducting business, but more often using the space for his secret tryst. Then, on the day of the murder, the footage revealed something that would break the case wide open, a heated argument between Robert and Grayson. In the grainy footage, Robert and Grayson could be seen standing in the basement, their voices raised in a fierce argument. The camera didn't capture the full audio, but it was clear from their body language that the confrontation was intense. Grayson appeared furious, his hands shaking as he gestured wildly, while Robert stood with his arms crossed, a look of defiance on his face. The argument seemed to escalate quickly. At one point, Grayson lunged toward Robert, and though the camera angle didn't capture everything, it was enough to show that the situation had turned physical. The final moments on the footage showed Grayson grabbing something, a luxury belt that Robert often wore, and wrapping it around Robert's neck. The struggle was brief but violent. Robert's body went limp as Grayson pulled tighter, his face contorted with rage and pain, and then it was over. Robert was dead, and Grayson stood over his stepfather's lifeless body, breathing heavily as the realization of what he had done sank in. The discovery of the hidden camera footage was a turning point in the investigation. After weeks of dead ends, Detective Peter Dalton finally had the evidence he needed to confront Grayson Eldridge. But the road to Grayson's confession wasn't straightforward. The footage, though damning, was not the end of the story. Grayson's emotional state, the manipulation by his mother, and the years of secrecy had created a psychological storm that would take time and patience to unravel. The arrest came swiftly after the discovery of the footage. Grayson was brought into the station for questioning, but this time, Detective Dalton approached the interrogation with a different mindset. He knew that Grayson was not a cold-blooded killer, but a deeply troubled young man who had been caught in a web of manipulation and emotional abuse. As Grayson sat across from Dalton, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes haunted by the weight of what he had done. He had been cooperative throughout the investigation, but now, with the footage placing him directly at the scene of the murder, The walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Dalton started slowly, acknowledging the pressure Grayson must have felt, both from Robert and from his mother, Mandy. He didn't accuse. Instead, he listened, giving Grayson the space to speak. It wasn't long before Grayson broke down, the flood of emotions that had been building inside him for years finally spilling out. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Grayson muttered, his voice cracking with each word. I wanted him to stop. I wanted it all to stop." As Grayson recounted the events of the day of the murder, it became clear that his actions had been driven by a toxic mix of betrayal, anger, and desperation. The argument that led to Robert's death had been simmering for weeks. Grayson had found out about Robert's infidelities with other men, and it had destroyed him. Robert had promised that what they had was special, that Grayson was different from the others. But in the end, Grayson realized he was just another one of Robert's conquests, used and discarded like the rest. The confrontation in the basement started with harsh words, but as the argument escalated, Grayson's emotions boiled over. He had grabbed the belt in a fit of rage, his mind clouded by years of manipulation and pain. In that moment, it wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything. The years of being used, the lies, the secrets, and the emotional abuse. Grayson snapped, and Robert paid the ultimate price. While Grayson's confession provided the answer to who killed Robert, it didn't explain everything. Mandy Eldridge's role in the events leading up to the murder was still a point of contention. Although she hadn't physically committed the crime, her emotional manipulation of Grayson had set the stage for the tragedy. As Grayson spoke about the pressure Mandy had put on him to continue the relationship with Robert, Dalton couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust. Mandy had known what Robert was doing to her son. She had known about the emotional toll it was taking on Grayson, yet she had chosen to protect her own ambitions rather than help him escape the toxic relationship. Mandy had convinced herself that keeping the affair secret was for the best, that it would protect both her career and Grayson's future. But in reality, it had done the opposite. By forcing Grayson to stay in the relationship, Mandy had allowed the emotional and psychological damage to fester, leading to the violent outburst that ended in murder. When Dalton confronted Mandy with Grayson's confession, she remained cold and detached, refusing to acknowledge her role and what had happened. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice flat and unfeeling. "I didn't force Grayson to do anything. He made his own choices," but Dalton knew better. While Mandy hadn't physically committed the murder, her manipulation of both Robert and Grayson had played a significant part in the events that led to Robert's death. In the eyes of the law, she wasn't guilty of murder, but her actions had set the wheels in motion for the tragedy that followed. Grayson's trial began on August 15, 2014, and it quickly became a media sensation. The details of the case, an affair between a stepfather and his stepson, a brutal murder, and the emotional manipulation of a mother, were the kind of salacious material that captivated the public's attention. Reporters flocked to the courthouse, eager for any new development in the case. District Attorney Clara Martinez, a sharp and methodical prosecutor, took the lead for the state. She framed the murder as an act of passion, driven by Grayson's deep-seated resentment and anger toward Robert. The hidden camera footage was the centerpiece of her case, showing the violent confrontation between the two men and Grayson's ultimate act of strangling Robert with the luxury belt. But Grayson's defense team, led by the non-binary attorney J. Cole, had a different narrative to tell. They argued that Grayson had been a victim of years of emotional manipulation, both by Robert, who had used his position of power to exploit Grayson, and by Mandy, who had pressured him to stay in the relationship to protect her own career. Cole painted a picture of a young man who had been emotionally broken, struggling with addiction and mental health issues, and who had finally snapped under the weight of the pressure placed on him. They didn't deny that Grayson had killed Robert, but they argued that it wasn't premeditated. It was an act of desperation, the result of years of psychological abuse. As the trial progressed, the jury was faced with a difficult decision. While the evidence clearly showed that Grayson had killed Robert, the emotional and psychological factors surrounding the case made it hard to determine the extent of his culpability. On September 5, 2014, the jury reached a verdict. Grayson Eldridge was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury believed that while the murder had been brutal, it was not premeditated. Grayson's emotional state and the manipulation he had endured played a significant role in their decision to convict him of the lesser charge. The sentencing came soon after. Grayson was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a harsh sentence, but one that reflected the severity of the crime. For Grayson, the trial's end marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one of reflection, regret, and hopefully rehabilitation. While Grayson was now paying for his crime, Mandy Eldridge's life was falling apart. The trial had exposed her manipulation and her willingness to sacrifice her own son's well-being for the sake of her career. The public, once supportive of her political ambitions, turned against her. Parents at the school she had worked so hard to lead began calling for her resignation, and the media painted her as the villain of the story. Mandy withdrew from the race for school superintendent, her political career in tatters. She sought therapy in the aftermath of the trial, but the damage had already been done. She was no longer the respected leader she had once been. Now she was the woman who had manipulated her son into staying in a relationship that led to murder. As Grayson began serving his sentence, he remained withdrawn and introspective. The weight of what he had done, combined with the years of emotional manipulation he had endured, left him broken. But within the walls of the prison, Grayson found a strange sense of clarity. He enrolled in counseling and began to study psychology, trying to make sense of his actions and the events that had led him to that fateful day. Though he knew he could never undo what he had done, Grayson hoped that by understanding the psychological factors that had shaped his life, he could one day help others avoid the same fate. His future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Grayson felt like he was on the path to healing. As the trial ended and Grayson Eldridge began serving his 25-year sentence, the aftermath of the Robert Eldridge murder case continued to ripple through the lives of those involved in the community of Orlando, Florida. The case had uncovered not just a murder, but a deep web of emotional manipulation, betrayal, and hidden secrets that would leave lasting scars. Mandy Eldridge had always been a woman who thrived on control. Her carefully curated image as a successful school principal, poised for political ascent, had been her shield. Yet in the wake of the trial, her fall from grace was both swift and brutal. The public now saw her as a manipulative mother who had allowed her son to be exploited by her husband and had even pressured him to stay in the relationship for her own selfish ambition. After the trial, Mandy withdrew completely from public life. The press painted her as a central figure in the moral unraveling of her family. Parents at her school petitioned for her removal, leading to her resignation as principal. She attempted to seek refuge in therapy, but the damage was far too extensive. Her political career was over, and the scandal surrounding her involvement had permanently tarnished her reputation. Mandy retreated to her family's summer home in Aspen, distancing herself from the community that had once admired her. She lived in isolation, a shadow of her former self. The loneliness and shame were overwhelming, and though she sought therapy to cope, many wondered if she would ever recover from the scandal that had consumed her life. For Grayson Eldridge, prison was both a punishment and an opportunity for reflection. He was only 21 years old when he was convicted, but the weight of his actions had aged him far beyond his years. Grayson had spent so long caught between his stepfather's manipulations and his mother's ambitions that he had never had a chance to find out who he truly was. In the early days of his sentence, Grayson was withdrawn, haunted by his role in Robert's death. The guilt he felt for killing his stepfather was overwhelming, but so too was the resentment toward Robert for his emotional manipulation. Grayson knew that his actions had been driven by years of exploitation and betrayal, yet he couldn't escape the feeling that he had destroyed his own life. Determined not to let his future slip away entirely, Grayson enrolled in counseling programs within the prison. He began studying psychology, hoping to understand the trauma he had endured and the mental health issues that had driven him to commit murder. Slowly, through therapy and self-reflection, Grayson began to come to terms with the choices he had made. He knew he could never undo the past, but he hoped that by understanding his own psychological struggles, he could help others avoid the same path of destruction. Over time, Grayson became a model inmate, taking advantage of every educational opportunity available to him. He participated in group therapy sessions and even began mentoring younger inmates who struggled with addiction and trauma. Grayson's story became one of redemption within the prison walls, though he would forever be marked by the crime he had committed. For Detective Peter Dalton, the Robert Eldridge case was one that would stay with him long after it was officially closed. Dalton had been a detective for over 30 years, and he had seen his share of brutal murders, but the complexity of the relationships involved in this case was unlike anything he had encountered before. Dalton had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached from the cases he worked on, but this one had struck a nerve. Grayson's confession, the hidden camera footage, and Mandy's manipulative role had revealed a family unraveling under the weight of secret. Dalton couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson had been a victim as much as he was a perpetrator, caught in a situation he didn't know how to escape. After the trial, Dalton took a brief leave from the department, needing time to process the emotional toll the case had taken on him. When he returned, he quietly resumed his work, but the Robert Eldridge case lingered in the back of his mind. It was a reminder that sometime, even when justice is served, there are no winners, only survivors. Maria Torres, the 30-year-old waitress whose life had been upended by Robert Eldridge's infidelity years earlier, had been cleared of any involvement in the murder. However, the emotional scars left by her discovery of Robert's affair with her then-husband were still fresh. For years, Maria had harbored deep resentment toward Robert for ruining her marriage, and she had been vocal about her hatred for him. But when the police had questioned her as a suspect in his murder, it had been a sobering experience. Though she had wanted Robert to suffer for what he had done to her life, she had never imagined him dead. After the trial, Maria decided to make a fresh start. She quit her job at the diner and moved to Denver, where she enrolled in a nursing program. She wanted to leave Orlando behind, along with all the painful memories tied to Robert. Though she would always carry the scars of her broken marriage, Maria found a sense of peace in starting over. The murder of Robert Eldridge and the subsequent trial had a profound impact on the town of Orlando, Florida. The case had exposed the darker undercurrents that ran beneath the town's seemingly perfect exterior. People who had once prided themselves on their tight-knit community now questioned how well they really knew their neighbors. The Eldridge family had been well known in Orlando, and Robert's success as a real estate agent had made him a prominent figure. But the revelations of his secret affairs, his relationship with his stepson, and the murder had left the town shaken. It was a reminder that even in the most affluent communities, secrets could lurk just below the surface, waiting to be exposed. For months after the trial, the murder was the topic of conversation in coffee shops, at school events, and around dinner tables. Parents worried about the impact the case might have on their own children, and neighbors were more cautious about who they trusted. Orlando eventually moved on, but the case of Robert Eldridge left an indelible mark on the town's collective memory. The scandal had pulled back the curtain on the hidden lives of its residents, revealing that beneath the veneer of success and stability, there could be chaos, deceit, and tragedy. The murder of Robert Eldridge and the subsequent trial became a case study in the complexity of human relationships and the psychological damage that secrets and manipulation can cause. For those involved, Grayson, Mandy, Maria, and even Detective Dalton, the case would define them for years to come. Grayson would forever carry the burden of having taken a life, but within the confines of prison, he found a path to redemption, hoping to one day help others avoid the destructive cycle of manipulation and betrayal that had led him to murder. Mandy, meanwhile, would live the rest of her life in isolation, haunted by the choices she had made and the son she had failed to protect. Her ambitions, once the driving force behind her actions, had cost her everything: her career, her family, and her reputation. For the town of Orlando, the Robert Eldridge murder case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden lives and unchecked ambition. It served as a reminder that behind every seemingly perfect facade, there could be darkness waiting to be revealed. And for Detective Peter Dalton, the case would always remain in his mind, a reminder of the human toll that crime takes, not just on the victim, but on everyone touched by it.